Welcome everybody. Welcome to the next in our series, Managerial Insights from the Darla School of Business. Welcome to us here in Executive Education at the University of South Carolina at Darla. We're joined today by Professor Mark Ferguson, who is the chair of the Management Sciences Department, who has a lot of experience, 30 years experience in research and teaching in the whole supply chain area. And he'll be talking with us today about the need to build resilient supply chains. And I'm sure that's something we've all experienced the effect of a disrupted supply chain with as we go about our lives since the COVID thing started. So just an idea of what we're about. We asked our professors to work with us in executive education if they would be interested in sharing some of their insights from their knowledge and research with companies and businesses within our community to give them some ideas to think about and act upon as we go through this rather strange and uncertain time. And as I say, today we have Dr. Mark Ferguson with us. A few things that will be happening. You can ask questions of Mark at the end of the session. You do that by asking a question via our chat function, which you will find at the bottom of the screen. Mark will be going through some of his slides, which will be available at the end of the presentation. This is also being recorded. I also want to welcome Mike Switzer here. Mike Switzer has been working with us since the beginning of this project. He and the South Carolina Business Review have been very, very positive partners with us as we go through this and joining us on this journey. So Mike will be asking questions that you post through the chat function, so please do that. At that, I am going to be quiet, and Mark, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you, Mike. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. So once again, Mark Ferguson, Department Chair of the Management Science Department, which unless you kind of are a recent grad from our business school, you may not know what management science is. But we're 31 faculty members. We deal with any type of process out there, you know, whether it's in the manufacturing industry or service industries. We study supply chain management. We study services, anything about getting or providing a product or service to the customers and the process of doing that. So if you're interested, we have the operations and supply chain major here at the school. It's about 300 undergrads a year come out of this program and go on to really interesting careers. The kind of silver lining of this, you know, unfortunate pandemic we're going through is that everyone is talking about supply chains now that weren't always using that term in the past. So we usually had to kind of try to recruit students after they already came to the business school and say, hey, you know anything about supply chains? Look at us over here. Maybe that will change a little bit with, you know, unfortunately people realizing how important supply chains are. So I want to kind of get into this topic by, let's play a little mind game. Let's set ourselves way, way back, it seems way back, to the end of February of this year. And you're, you know, at this time, you've only got a handful of COVID-19 cases in the US, but you are hearing reports from other countries, particularly China, Italy, Spain, you know, and some of them are really scary and horrific, you know, of the healthcare systems being, you know, not having enough capacity, all the suffering and all that was coming from this disease. And you decide, well, maybe I should think about preparing. And you start thinking items that you may need if the pandemic, you know, does manifest itself in our local area. You might think of things like masks or disinfectants or hand sanitizer, and these would make sense, right? You know, because their usage is probably going to go up if the pandemic does, you know, come to our area. These are things we would use more of. But I would challenge you to really think back and think, did anyone foresee that the last one, toilet paper, would be missing or be short supply? Well, looking back in hindsight, we know that this item was also one of those that was really, really hard to obtain. And actually still today, we're, middle of June 2020, and we're still having shortages of supply. We haven't gotten back to where we were in February. So I thought I would kind of use toilet paper just as a way of looking at supply chains and kind of where they can fail. And that should help us think about supply chains in general and maybe how we can redesign them to make them a little more resilient. So most of us are familiar with toilet paper, at least in the US market here. There's three main manufacturers: Procter & Gamble, Kimberly-Clark, and Georgia-Pacific. You probably know these brands very well, but you may not realize there were so many different variations out there, and this doesn't even include all the package sizes and everything. And the neat thing about toilet paper, makes it fairly unique, I would say, is it's pretty stable demand in normal times. This graph on the left kind of shows that, right? It shows the increase and decrease in demand over the beginning of January till about the middle of March. You can see very little variability there, but all of a sudden you see this huge spike about middle of March, actually increased 732%. And it looks kind of like it evens off or comes back to normal after that. It was kind of a one-time spike, but that really wasn't the case. The graph on the right shows the out-of-stock levels for toilet paper at the US grocery stores. And you see right after about March 15th, it's anywhere from 60 to 70% out of stock in general. So everyone's kind of asking the question, what happened? Why toilet paper? It is such an odd item that you would not have expected. So the popular press, when they started learning about this, kind of automatically went to, well, people must be panic buying. We kind of see this behavior before. We see it with natural disasters. If a hurricane is forecast to come through an area, people will run out and buy supplies. But these are usually short-term impacts, and they're kind of regional impacts. So after a couple of days or maybe a week at max, things kind of get back to normal. Well, I looked into this a little bit, and really, if it was just panic buying, we should not still see shortages today. There must have been something else going on besides just the panic buying. So to really think about this, we have to kind of go back to basic concepts of supply chain management. And what do we really try to do in supply chain management? And ultimately, at a very high level, we're just trying to match supply and demand. So there's some demand out there for a good or service, and through the supply chain, through all the partners, of procuring raw materials and producing products or producing services, we try to match that demand, not have too much and not have too little. So the supply chain for toilet paper, especially the consumer market toilet paper, you start with raw materials, which is trees. This gets sent to paper mills, get turned into toilet paper. It gets sent to retail distribution centers, which gets sent to retail stores. And finally, we're down here at the consumer side, and we go and purchase from the stores. So let's start on the demand side and say, well, what happened on the demand side? Because unlike the disinfectants and the masks and things, we wouldn't really expect people to be using a lot more toilet paper than they did prior to the pandemic. And in fact, there really isn't much variability over time in toilet paper, unlike a lot of items. It's typically non-seasonal, doesn't have seasonal peaks. It's very predictable. Typically has a low margin type of product, which means that, your Cottonelle is not that much different than your Angel Soft. So the manufacturers don't use promotions a lot in this area, and promotions drive variability in the demand cycle. So there's not a lot of reason for them to. You don't typically see big sales on toilet paper and you rush out and buy a lot of extra. But toilet paper actually has two markets. And the first one I showed you, and I'm showing you again here, is the consumer market. So this is where you and I, as consumers, we actually go out and purchase our own toilet paper for our household. But there's another market, which is kind of the B2B market, where it's a different supply chain that are providing toilet paper to businesses. This could be a big office building, it could be a university campus, it could be, any of these places where people need toilet paper that's not in their own home, restaurants, you name it. And this actual supply chain was affected on the demand side. So these are actually different products. They may look kind of the same, but the commercial toilet paper market is typically really large rolls. They go in these dispensers you probably find in like a, restaurant or a cafeteria or something like that. Usually it's a little lower quality. They like to make this less attractive to steal. So sometimes it kind of feels like sandpaper. So it's not the same as the toilet paper on the right, which is more what we're used to in our own homes. It might be 2-ply, very soft, much smaller size roll. And before the pandemic hit, the market was split about 40% for commercial and about 60% for the consumer. But these came from totally different plants. They came through different distribution networks and everything. So what happens in March as the businesses and the university campuses and the commercial market in general just starts to shut down. So you lose this 40% and it shifts over to the consumer market. And what this leads to is actually about a 66% increase in the demand in the consumer side, where it was not easy to quickly adjust from producing, consumer market rolls of toilet paper to commercial market rolls of toilet paper. Like I said, these were different, coming from different plants. They're coming through different distribution networks. So that was one thing that happened on the demand side. I promise not to get technical here, but I think it does help to link these to kind of some core concepts we talk about in supply chain management. And one is a reorder point. Like even in your household, we're actually all supply chain managers when you think about it. If you are running a household or you're involved in replenishing, goods for your household, you're a supply chain manager. You have to decide when you need to replenish or restock. And the simplest way to think about this is there's a regular usage rate. Let's say we'll use a roll of toilet paper every 2 days. And then there's a lead time for replenishing. So maybe we replenish our toilet paper from ordering on Amazon and it arrives the next day. So we'll count that as a 2-day lead time. Well, if we use one roll every 2 days and it takes 2 days to resupply, then if there was no variability in our usage and it always arrived, the day after we order it, we would just watch our inventory, and when it drops down to one roll, we would place an order, and then as soon as we ran out, we would get a resupply. This is kind of commonly known as a reorder point policy. It's used in businesses all around the world for managing their inventories. Now, in the real world, this was a textbook example. Now you kind of look at realistic situations. There's variability. There's variability in the usage. There may even be a little variability in the lead time. And if you continue with the reorder point that you used if you ignored variability, which in our example was just, down to one roll before we place a replenishment. Well, maybe your kids bring some friends home, or has a nosebleed or something, and you end up using more toilet paper or at a faster rate than what you were typically used to. You may run out before that replenishment comes in. And this is not a good thing. People don't want to run out of toilet paper. So what they do in response, and what businesses do in response, is they carry something called safety stock. Safety stock kind of raises that reorder point level. So maybe instead of waiting until I get down to one roll, maybe I would place the replenishment order when it's down to 2 or 3. That's extra inventory that I'm carrying, in this case, in my household, kind of before I place that replenishment order. I don't let it drop below that. And this helps buffer me, if you will, or you buffer your household for, if the usage rate increased or if the lead time happened to increase. But the core concept here, and we teach this in our classes, is the more variability you have, the more safety stock you have to carry. So think of this in your own experience when you first saw the shortages. If you're like most households, you may only buy one reasonably sized, package of toilet paper every time you go to the grocery store. Maybe it's a 4-pack or a 6-pack. And you always know it's there. Every time you go, there's toilet paper available. Well, then you show up one week and you're doing your shopping and you go to the toilet paper aisle and it's not there. What do you do? Well, the next time you see toilet paper available, you're going to buy more than you normally do. This is not illogical. This is actually, you can use the formulas to show that this is very logical behavior. So what's often kind of termed panic buying, oftentimes is actually a very rational reaction to the increased uncertainty of knowing when supplies will be available again. And the more uncertainty there is, the more you feel like you need to hold in safety stock, eventually until either your budget runs out or you have no more room in your house to hold it. And that's kind of how I chose my virtual background here. You may have noticed I don't actually have toilet paper stored in every room of my house, but I thought it was appropriate for this presentation. So let's recap on the demand side. What happened? So the toilet paper demand was normally split between the commercial and the consumer side. But when the commercial sector almost completely shut down, all of that demand shifted in a very short period of time to the consumer market. So this was a big spike on the consumer side of the toilet paper demand. In addition, when consumers are making their personal stocking decisions, they're basing this on the cost of going to the store and the uncertainty of an item being available. So in addition to maybe increasing their safety stock, they may go to the store less often. It's actually dangerous nowadays to go to the store. It increases your chances of catching COVID-19. So maybe you want to go less. And if you go into the store less, you're going to buy larger amounts. This is perfectly rational behavior as well. So you're buying larger amounts just because you go into the store less, and you're also buying larger amounts because you want to hold more safety stock in your household. So all of this affected the demand side of the toilet paper supply chain. What about the supply side? A little bit on the supply for the kind of toilet paper supply chain in the US. It's pretty much fixed capacity. And I'll talk about this a little bit in another slide or two, but it runs at high utilization and carries very small safety stocks on the supply side of many different varieties and package sizes. So we'll go through these kind of one by one. Let's start with the raw inputs. There was actually a disruption in the supply of raw inputs. This didn't get talked about very much, but we don't typically use full trees and send them to paper mill manufacturing plants. Oftentimes, it's the wood chips, which are a byproduct of the primary product used from the, the trees harvested, that they're turned into 2x4s or 2x8s. And what's left over is ground into chips and then sent over to things like paper mills at a much lower cost than if they were buying timber, virgin timber, for example. So once again, about March hits, guess what? Construction slows down. Construction slows down. There's less demand for the primary products, the boards. Thus, there's less supply of the raw material, the chips, going for the paper manufacturing. So it didn't completely shut them down, but they did have to, make some adjustments and find additional sources for their raw inputs. What about the paper mills themselves? I mean, couldn't they just ramp up production when they saw there was a shortage? Well, paper mills are a really high investment type of manufacturing environment. In fact, a typical paper mill costs about $300 million. They're usually built over in Germany. They take multiple years to build a new paper manufacturing plant. So it's not like you can just go out and double your production capacity in a couple of weeks just because demand increased. The other thing is they already are running at about a 92% utilization. So if you have a really expensive piece of equipment and you have a low margin product like toilet paper, the only way to make money is to run that really expensive piece of equipment at a really high utilization rate. Just churn out a lot of toilet paper because you're only making a small amount on each roll. And you can kind of see this in the next map. So we mapped out where are all the paper mills in the US. And the US market is primarily supplied from US suppliers, from paper mills in the US. It's not a product that's very cost effective to, ship from overseas, for example. And you can kind of see there's not a lot of them. And each one of these was already highly utilized or heavily utilized. So the manufacturers couldn't make quick adjustments. Well, what about the retailers? I mean, surely they must have had some extra stock in the system somewhere that they could redistribute once the shortages came. Well, let's look at the retail distribution centers. There seems to be a lot of them. This is just the ones for Walmart and Target. And it's not even including the ones for fresh produce. These are the type of distribution centers in the Southeast area. And you could replicate this map, for all the different regions of the country, and it'll look very similar. So it seems like there's a lot of distribution centers out there. Why wasn't there a lot of, toilet paper, extra safety stock of toilet paper sitting around in warehouses? Well, the answer is that doesn't really happen that much anymore. Retailers came to the conclusion that they don't make money on inventory that's sitting around in a warehouse. They make money by turning that inventory over as fast as possible. So the least amount of time it sits in a warehouse, the lower their costs are, especially for a low margin and bulky product like toilet paper. So one of the things that's gone on in recent, probably the last 15 years in retail distribution networks is something called cross-docking. Cross-docking is, you see the trucks over on the left, these are full truckloads coming from, say, the manufacturing plants, coming from that paper mill with just toilet paper on it. But instead of being stored in the actual distribution center, that inventory gets sent directly to those trucks on the right. These are mixed pallets trucks, and these are going to the actual retail centers. So a typical SKU of toilet paper may spend less than a day in a Walmart or Target distribution center. In fact, the least amount of time they can spend in there, the more profitable and more efficient that supply chain is. So there wasn't a lot of safety stock sitting around in warehouses. So just to kind of recap on the supply side, there was a disruption in the raw material for making toilet paper. It wasn't as huge as the change on the demand side, but it still had an effect, and they still had to plan around it. And then when you get to the paper mill plants that actually make the toilet paper, these were very heavily utilized, very expensive equipment that were already typically running 3 shifts, 7 days a week, because how else are you going to recoup that investment, that $300 million investment? You've got to run it as much as possible. And then finally, on the distribution side, because toilet paper is bulky and it's low margin, you don't make any money on toilet paper sitting around in inventory, then there's been a lot of innovations, in the retail distribution network, especially about just minimizing the amount of time and amount of inventory that something like toilet paper spends. So what did the toilet paper manufacturers do to adjust? What did Procter & Gamble do? What did Kimberly-Clark do? What did Georgia-Pacific do? As I kind of described going through the supply chain, they didn't have a lot of levers left, but they did make some changes that helped the situation. So for one thing, those paper mill plants didn't just make toilet paper. A lot of times they would make other things like napkins or maybe tissues, and they have to change over each time they made something different. So they shifted some of that capacity to just making toilet paper. This allowed them to increase their capacity for replenishing toilet paper orders without having to add any new expensive equipment. The other thing they did is they reduced their variations. So remember that slide where I showed you all the different product varieties of toilet paper? If you go to a store today and you're lucky enough to kind of find some in stock, you're probably going to see just one variety. And that's what they've been doing. They just picked the most popular, package size and product variety and just started producing that. Because customers are not choosy when there's a shortage. This resulted in fewer changeovers, which also helped them increase their utilization of their plants. So every time you change from one variety to another, you basically have to kind of shut that manufacturing line down for a amount of time and change over some equipment, and that decreases your utilization. So by making this change, they were able to get their utilization up from about 92% before the pandemic to about 99% today. The other thing they did is they started skipping the distribution centers directly and just delivering directly to the stores. Now, obviously, the store has to be a certain size for them to be able to do this economically, but it would reduce the lead time from manufacturing plant to the actual final retail or final destination, if you will. And finally, the last one was they started providing almost hourly updates to their customers. As you can imagine, if you're a retailer like Publix or Kroger's or Walmart or Costco or Sam's Club, you're very concerned when customers come in and they can't find the products that they feel they really need. So the supply chain managers have been constantly on the phone, constantly getting updates, even knowing, kind of down to the minute, this is where our shipment is and this is when it's going to arrive, and we can kind of let our customers know. And you kind of have seen this if you're following social media. There'll be announcements in your community Facebook group of, oh, Sam's Club's going to have, toilet paper on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. And there'll be a big crowd kind of waiting. But the kind of important thing to get from this is communication helps kind of deter some of that, less helpful decisions. Like maybe I don't stock or I don't buy as much if I'm in constant communication. I kind of know when those resupplies are going to come. So I'll kind of finish up by taking this to a broader level and discussing a few things we can do for our own supply chains. What can we learn from this? I use toilet paper as kind of an example because it's something obviously all of us have probably had experience with the last couple of months. But there's certainly lessons we can take from this, no matter what your industry is. And the first one is, don't assume business as usual. In fact, don't assume this for probably until we have a widespread vaccine or treatment. So we're not going back to February of 2020 in terms of the business world for quite some time. We need to expect more disruptions out there. We've never really had a world event like this that has affected worldwide demand and worldwide supply at the same time. So a lot of this we're kind of figuring out as we go. There was no blueprint for this. But what this really means, in terms of supply chains, is you need to plan for longer lead times. One reason no one really talked about supply chains outside of this field was they ran so well prior to this pandemic. If you always get what you need in a very short amount of time, you don't have to think much about where it came from or how it got there or what network it came through. Most of us are thinking about these nowadays, especially for what we kind of consider critical supplies, like in the medical fields or in personal protection equipment or in our food supply chains. We're starting to realize that these supply chains are fairly fragile, and it doesn't take too many disruptions to really affect us. One thing that hasn't really been discussed in the popular press yet, and maybe it's not happening, but this is one thing I really worry about, is spare part shortages. Spare parts are kind of the afterthought for most supply chains. You kind of keep one in stock, or maybe if a key piece of equipment breaks down, like if that paper making machine breaks down at a Georgia Pacific plant, historically, they might fly an engineer out from the company in Germany. They'll be there, the next day. They'll be able to get that piece of equipment up and running. They can kind of airship in the spare parts they need. You can't really assume that anymore. So it's going to become much more important to think about preventive maintenance, to look at your stocking levels of your spare parts that you feel like you reasonably could need in the next 6 months, and not wait until something happens, because if you wait until something happens, you're going to be, in my view, probably really disappointed. You're not going to get the responsiveness that you've seen in the past. At our household level, I would say this even comes down to maybe we need to proactively have our air conditioning units inspected before it's the middle of summer, because those spare parts are sourced from all around the world, and this pandemic is affecting different parts of the world at different rates. So we never know what we're going to run short of, and you don't want to run short of it at the really critical time. The other one I'll say is just over communicate. Anytime there is disruptions in the supply chain, where there's increased variability, where there's increased anxiety, communication almost always helps. Communication is good even in normal times, but during crisis, it's a necessity. And I would err on the side of over communicating. Constantly, especially if like you're supplying something that is running short, over communicate with your customers, tell them exactly, what the problems are and where you are and what you're trying to do to fix it and when you think it'll be resolved. Kind of related to that is, if you do find yourself providing something that has shortages, then you have to go to some kind of allocation scheme. And this is something we do know about. This has been studied a lot because it's not the first time, that supplies have been short and have had to be allocated. But what I can tell you from the research in this area is if you base your allocations on the size of the current orders, you're going to exacerbate the problems because your customers are just going to start ordering more quantity than they need, knowing that they'll only get a certain percentage of what they order. So don't allocate it based on the size of the new orders. If you can, look back on past sales before the shortage happened and come up with some allocation scheme based on the percentage of past sales. This will alleviate the incentive for your customers to kind of intentionally inflate their orders. And the problem with inflated orders is when you finally do catch up, with the demand, you tend to order too much yourself because you don't know what the true demand is. You don't know how much of those were real orders and how much were just the inflated parts. So if you don't handle this allocation problem the correct way, you can really get blindsided at the end and have way too much stock. And then the last one is just use this opportunity, and then especially when we get out of the crisis mode, to kind of pursue some longer term structural changes. The title of this talk was Building More Resilient Supply Chains. I think there's going to be a national effort looking at this, especially for what's deemed to be critical supplies. You can imagine a stress test, just the way the banks have stress tests. We may have stress tests for supply chains of critical components. We need to play more what ifs, right? What if this region of the country is completely cut off for 6 months? What does this do to our supply? Things like this, I think you're going to see much more focus on dual sourcing for more than one region, or parts that could be easily swapped over from one area to another, or even short-term solutions like 3D printing or things like that. But let's not let these lessons, go to waste. If things get back to normal, that's great, but something like this will happen again in the future, and I think we need to be more ready for it next time. So that's my talk. Hopefully there'll be a few questions out there. And I'm going to stop the sharing here.
All right, good job, sir. Excellent. And I know we got a lot of feedback on our discussion on the radio show about the toilet paper thing. So I'm sure that's influenced your presentation today. It's because it's certainly been something that I know a lot of people have been curious about and wondering, why are we out of toilet paper? So
that's my number one question I get at, any kind of what public forums we're allowed to have now, right?
So do you think the supply chains are in any way prepared for this supposed second wave that's coming?
So I think the items that have already been short there's been a lot of study and a lot of work on those. I think we'll be much better prepared for things like personal protection equipment, or disinfectants or ventilators or things like that if there's a second wave. But I also think there's going to be things we just didn't anticipate. And we're starting to see this now, like in the food supply chain, especially the meats and all, how certain manufacturing environments can be more risky for the spread of disease, and can completely shut down a very large, say, meat processing plant, for example, because the employees are getting sick. I think you're going to see more of that, but it's really hard to anticipate exactly what items, are going to be affected.
All right, let me remind everybody also, if you have a question for Mark, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. We have one that just came in for you, Mark. At least 20 years ago, we had more redundancy built into supply systems. Were we really that much more inefficient? Hence, have you seen any works that estimate the relative cost changes if we have more redundancy in supply systems of certain industries?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's typically thought of as a trade-off, right? Do I have a lot of redundancy? You can think of redundancy in terms of extra capacity or extra inventory. Both of those count as redundancy, but that also makes the overall supply chain less efficient. So I would say, over the last 20 years, certainly the focus has been on the efficiency side. Let's make the supply chain as lean as possible. Let's take out as much excess capacity, as much excess inventory. Let's get the price of the product down as much as we can. And for some products, that's probably still the best way to go. But I think that type of thinking has been applied to all products and things, even something like, masks, for example. I think I read 95% of our, hospital masks were made overseas. Well, yeah, that's the leanest, probably most cost-effective way to make them, but that's an item that it might actually pay to make, to add some redundancies, to do some dual sourcing where some of it is in country, just to add more resiliency. So I think we're going to take a more careful look and kind of separate items into the nice to have and the critical to have. And probably on the critical to have, cost efficiency and leanness and efficiency is maybe not the only metric we should be looking at.
And so do you definitely see then repatriation of some items like face masks, maybe apparel, so many things that are made overseas?
There is, already conversations at the national level, not just our country, but other countries, about repatriating some of that or requiring it. And they do this for military supplies. If you're putting a part into a tank, for example, you have to show that, the parts you're sourcing from can be locally sourced. So there are, procedures and policies and stuff already out there. I think you'll probably see some of this extended to non-military supplies, but what are considered critical. But also you don't have to source everything, in country to reduce your risk. You just need to source it more broadly. So maybe instead of 95% coming from Asia, maybe that goes down to 60%. And you also include some from Mexico, or you include some from the, South American countries or from Europe or something like that. The more spread out you can put it, then when events target particular regions of the world, you're not as exposed.
I am starting to see a lot of investors looking at Mexico as a place of inexpensive labor that a lot of the Asian items might be shifted to.
Yeah.
All right, now here's another question. How have the lessons learned in the past with regard to disaster relief helped the improvement and understanding of supply chains, such as building regional depots?
Yeah, so the disaster relief, and there's been a lot of work in our field on, they call it humanitarian logistics, of when a disaster hits a particular region, how do we get the kind of life-saving supplies to that region as quickly as possible and distribute it as quickly as possible. I think some of that knowledge was used recently, when we had these shortages of things like personal protection equipment and all. But it was never really designed to be used at that scale or to be implemented at that scale. Like if South Carolina got hit by a hurricane, knock on wood, then we've seen this before. Like other areas of the country are very quick to kind of consolidate the resources and to help out and to send in bottled water or, food or clothing or whatever that the population that was affected needs. When it's the entire country, and it's also happening everywhere around the world, it's a much, much more difficult problem to tackle.
And one more question, unless anybody has any more. Remember the chat button there at the bottom to send in your questions. How can managers and business owners, any further tips on how they can best prepare for supply disruptions? And I really found that one point that you made about spare parts. I don't know how many people even thought of that, spare parts, especially on critical equipment, that, that kind of thing. Maybe instead of having one spare part, maybe you need 2 or 3.
Right.
So any other tips in that area?
Yeah, so this one, you have to kind of hold your suppliers, accountable, right? If you buy a piece of equipment, for example, make your supplier provide you with a plan of, well, what happens if this goes down? Let's play scenarios, right? You could imagine doing this, with a home purchase. You're buying a refrigerator or a car or something. We kind of take for granted that if something breaks down that we need critically, we can kind of get it fixed fairly quickly, and the parts are going to be there and all. But you can kind of put in the contracts before you make those purchases, of some resiliency that your suppliers have to provide. Maybe they need to hold spare parts in country, for example, at a regional warehouse or something, instead of outside of the country, where you may not even be able to get it across the border. If you already have equipment and everything, the preventive maintenance, I would start now. I would start before you have breakdowns, or if you're looking at maybe a peak of demand that's coming up, at the end of the summer or in the fall or something, I would not assume the normal lead times. I would start preparing for it earlier than you normally would. For example, the back to school season, or if that's what your main selling season is, and you normally start maybe stocking up for that in July, I would probably go ahead and start now.
Well, Mark, thank you very much. That's going to do it for our questions and for our presentation today. I guess we can bring Ray back in to close things out. I want to remind everybody that the next episode in this series that airs on the South Carolina Business Review radio show airs on Wednesday at 10 till 8 on all 8 stations, NPR stations across South Carolina. We will be interviewing Gerald McDermott, who's a professor of international trade, and he will share with us his insights on, especially with South Carolina being such a major player on the global economic stage now, with so many foreign manufacturing plants located here, what the importance of all that is with the new pandemic world that we're in right now. So that's this Wednesday, and then of course a week from today he will be with us for the Zoom conference as we are now. So Ray.
Thank you, Mike, and Mark, thank you. That was really, really interesting, fascinating. So one of my big questions I've been trying to address in life has been solved. I've got a few other big ones to solve, and I'll be calling by your office sometime to get the answers to those. That was really interesting, very clear. I really enjoyed that. So for everyone listening, you may not know that the Dartmouth School of Business actually has some very top-ranked programs running within it. I think that's often overlooked within South Carolina and beyond. Mark's program, supply chain program, and the operations side of it as well, is one of the top programs of its kind in the US. And next week, we have Gerald McDermott joining us from the top ranked program in international business in the US. So Jerry will be with us next week. You've heard what he will be talking about with Mark. So you have 2 of our top programs in two consecutive weeks. So thank you to both of you. Thank you for all of those that have been listening and joining in. Remember that Mark's PowerPoint and pictures of toilet rolls will be available for you as soon as this is finished, unless our supply chain is disrupted in some way by Mark, perhaps. This recorded program will be made available on our website in about 2 days when it's gone through the transcription process it has to go through. Please download it, share it, send this out to all the other people that you think might find this helpful and useful, and reach out to us if you have any questions for Mark. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.